Our basic agenda, we're here until 5-ish, but we're going to stop at 4, and then from 4 to 5 I have space for individual consultations. And some people indicated whether they want kind of like a one-on-one chat, and there's about 10 people who want that. So at some point I'll put up a timeline or something over there, and you can sign up and do it that way, or we can just have people together. I'm not really sure. But I find that a lot of people have like very specific questions related to their work. Bring that up during any part of this as well. You know, you don't have to wait until the end. I just find that is usually the case that people have, you know, stuff they want to chat about. So, a little bit about me. I'm Tom Johnson. I work at Amazon at Moffett Towers, just right here in the area. I've been in California for about 6 years. Before that, I was in Utah, in Florida, in New York. I work in the App Store division of Amazon. Work on, welcome, come on in, Michael. I work on documentation related to Fire TV app development. So people who are creating apps that they want to put on Fire TV, like Netflix, Hulu, that kind of stuff, they have lots of concerns and need information. That's what I tend to focus on. We have people from a lot of big companies here: VMware, Cisco, NetApp, Splunk, Google, Bing. People from San Diego. Is anybody outside of California here? Where are you coming in from?
Coming from Vancouver.
Vancouver, sweet.
Yeah, I work for a company called Avigilon.
Avigilon, okay.
I've never heard of them, but we're watching security and surveillance.
Is that the tagline? You've never heard of us, but we're watching.
Be afraid. I feel so much better today.
Yeah. If you need power, there's power outlets and Wi-Fi. Any questions? Anything that the bathrooms are around the corner? We're going to dive into the topic that I feel pretty passionate about. About 6 years ago, I was working for a company in Utah, and all of a sudden, due to a new CEO and restructuring, they kind of just laid off the tech pubs team. And it caught me by surprise a little bit. I was looking to leave anyway, but it motivated me to think more about my career and the directions I wanted to go. And I decided at that moment to take this severance package they gave us and make my way out to California, which if you ever, transition from another state into California, you do need like a huge chunk of money. And I decided I wanted to be in a field that, was more lucrative, stable, but also just wasn't going to be subject to being carved out at any one moment. And this area is like the mecca of technology, right? It's the mecca of tech, and there's so many opportunities. But in this Bay Area, specifically in California and Silicon Slopes and all, I think a huge trend is towards the developer documentation field. And specifically, I've focused here on like REST API documentation because it's an easy transition into this developer documentation world. But API docs are just one part of a larger developer domain. Let me go through quickly what we'll talk about. If you go to my site, I'dRatherBeWriting.com, let me just point you to it, and you click here, API Doc, this takes you to my API Doc course. If you expand the first section under course slides and workshop activities, those two are going to be key today. All right, well, not so much course slides for you, but the workshop activities. The course slides breaks out what we'll talk about. Part 1, intro to API documentation. Part 2, using an API like a developer. In this, so my approach is that like you need some hands-on experience making requests with an API to get a sense of what they're all about before you dive into the details of documentation. Part 3, documenting API endpoints. This is the reference part of documentation. Part 4, OpenAPI and Swagger. This is the specifications around how to document APIs. Part 6, I know there's no part 5, I skipped it. Non-reference content. This is sections about like authentication, sections about getting started, things like that. Part 7, publishing API documentation. We'll talk about different tools that render the Open API spec, as well as like docs as code. Part 8, getting a job in API documentation. So my plan is that each of these will take about an hour or so, and throughout it all, I have a lot of workshop activities. So if you click the workshop activities, you should see activities that relate to each of these parts. We have about, 15, 20 activities, and they expand down here with the details. Now, I have gone to great lengths because I've given API workshops quite a few times. Not so many full day ones like this. A lot of them are like half day. But I've found that even the simplest task, I run into all kinds of technical issues. So I have gone to great lengths to try to make them issue free. We'll see if that happens today. Actually, I started this course probably 3 years ago when Expert Support, it's like a tech writing staffing company in this area, hired me to give some API workshops to their writers. And I gave three 3-hour workshops over 3 weeks or something. And I started to develop this content and evolve it and add to it and grow to it. So I built it out into this whole course. All this information, you'll find more detail in this course in each of these sections that I'm trying to move forward into like a more formal book, but really so much of this is online. I think it's easier to work with online. All right, so hopefully you find the site, I'dRatherBeWriting.com, and then API doc, and you're able to get to wherever you're going. Any questions before we dive into just this intro?
On the website, how do we do it?
I'dRatherBeWriting.com, and then in the top toolbar, click API doc.
Yep.
And that should take you. Yep. And then in that first section, you should see course slides and course or workshop activities. Yeah. Yeah. The slides is mostly just for me, but it shows you the agenda for today. I also record pretty much everything I do, so I'm recording this. If you just keep that in mind. Don't say anything that you don't ever want to get back to you, or if you do, tell me to edit it out or so forth. But okay. So let's get into this, and then we'll get to know you a little bit better. I need to stop standing in front of this. I'll figure that out in a minute. The growth of REST APIs in the last 10 years has been pretty phenomenal. Have you ever seen this chart from Programmable Web? This is a site that tracks web APIs, which include REST APIs primarily. And since 2005, which if you look there, what happened in 2005? Well, eBay was making an API so that people who are selling products on eBay wouldn't have to go to the store interface to update every one of their products, but could do it remotely. So this whole idea of using a system to update another system through an API was sort of born. And since that time, REST APIs have taken off. Before this point, the primary kind of API was the native library API, like a Java API, a C++ API, some other code base that you incorporate directly into your application. But the REST API is a shift, and it has really taken off. I don't know why they sort of stopped updating this, but they have probably twice or 3 times as many APIs. And what they do is they sort of index them, describe them, put links to them, and track this progress. But the reason in this workshop I typically just call it API documentation is because most APIs nowadays are REST APIs. Now, somebody emailed me the other day and they said, look, there's these new APIs that are coming out. Does this date the REST APIs? And the technology field continues to evolve, and maybe in 5 years, maybe REST APIs won't be that big of a deal, or maybe they will be the only deal. At any rate, right now, REST APIs are growing. And what does this mean? Well, all of these APIs need documentation, right? So it's this tremendous opportunity for technical writers in this area or in this field. What's particularly sweet about these APIs is that unlike JavaDoc or some of these other older APIs, with REST APIs, there's a lot more variation in how they're put together. They don't follow this exact same standard. They kind of align to general characteristics, and so people have to rely on the documentation. But more than that, the documentation is kind of the product in a way. There's no GUI system where people log in and they see a bunch of options on a screen like a traditional product interface, right? So what do developers get when they buy into your API? They get documentation on how to use it, right? That's kind of like their map and that's how they get around. So the documentation is incredibly important. Companies want their documentation to be attractive, to sell, to kind of illuminate the user on how the product works. It has to be sexy and sizzle and so forth. People rate the documentation extremely highly. In this survey, I can't remember if this comes from Programmable Web or from like GitHub or something, but the developers rated complete and accurate docs as the most important part of your API. You know, more than like whether there's language-specific libraries or if you have an API console or Explorer or user forums. Service-specific Twitter account. I can't believe they were probably laughing when they added that. Like, okay. Anyway, actually, I shouldn't underestimate that. I check GitHub when I feel like it goes down. I look there. Anyway, yeah, the documentation super important. Companies know that, and so they look for people who can create documentation that is going to help sell their product, and this is where we come in. Now, the web overall is also transitioning to more of this mashup. Nowadays, when you build a site, you don't necessarily get an all-in-one package. You start out with some basic component, some basic, static site generator or something, or basic framework, and then you start to add on services. So, for example, you want an email campaign, you integrate MailChimp. You want forums, you integrate your Discuss forums. You want this store service, and you want the financial payment process. You've got Stripe, and you've got Magento, and other kinds of services. And the web overall is sort of transitioned into this different conglomeration of services that you pull together into your site based on what you want. One developer told me that the average number of APIs that somebody pulls into their site or uses when they're building a site is between 8 and 10. And I was like, wow. This is the founder of readme.io, which we'll mention a little bit later. But yeah, like how many, for all of you who are at different companies, does your company offer some kind of information or product through an API? Does your company have an API? Raise your hand. Yeah, I mean, obviously it's sort of self-selecting because you're here. but yeah, I mean, almost, if you just take almost any company now and add the word API and do a search for it, you pretty much find something. I mean, there's a sports API for everything. There's an API for even the most mundane companies that you might not even think would have an API. All right. The job market around APIs is quite hot. This is a sample job for, I pulled this a while ago. It's not like this is current, but it says the client wants to find somebody who will emulate Dropbox's developer documentation. And I think this is quite common. People look at some of these cool doc sites, especially Stripe. People are always holding up Stripe because they love it. And they say, we want somebody who is going to create documentation like that for our company. And if you can do that, that is tremendous. Of course, this sort of gets into the publishing angle, which we'll hit later. But being able to plug into this job market will expand your possibilities. The more skilled you are in developer documentation, the more job possibilities you have. the more the more stable you feel, but also in some weird ways, I think it's a field where I think people always feel kind of like they're coming up short on a technical skill level. You know, I had this discussion with Mark Baker about this. He's like, the technical writer is usually the least qualified person for the job. But anyway, we'll get into that later. It's a good field to be in. It's a good direction, but even regardless of job prospects, developer documentation it's meaty to sink your teeth into. There's lots there. You're not going to grow tired of it because there's so much learning that's involved. It's more than any other field. To excel, to survive and thrive, you have to incorporate constant learning of technology and your product and so forth. And in this landscape where there's a new technology popping up every week, it's kind of daunting, but that's where it is. All right, so what is an API? I've been talking generally, and this is sort of the intro, but an API allows two systems to interact. If you look at this analogy of a cog here, you have system 1 on the left and system 2 on the right. How do the two relate? Well, the API is this little thing in the middle that allows them to talk to each other. And these are like computers, right? You have one computer and it's talking to another computer and they're interacting. Probably the most common example, which we see every day, is like a YouTube video that's embedded in a website, right? The code underneath is talking to YouTube and is grabbing information and is pulling it back into the site. It's pretty much what APIs do. They go and get information from someplace and they pull it back in, or they send it somewhere and they get it. But it's two systems interacting. There's one guy who's kind of like the father of API docs in this area a long time ago, Jim Biso, who gave a workshop. He liked to bring up this analogy of a calculator, even though this is not really a web API thing. But if you imagine when you press buttons on any interface, it's 2 + 2, whatever, and then you hit like equals. Underneath, there's some algorithms that are processing and things that are going on, and then it returns some kind of information. APIs are very much like that. You have an interface that somebody's designed, but underneath it, you've got APIs making calls out to services, getting information, doing something with it, bringing it back into the interface. So you could have a product interface that looks like a standard web app or something. Underneath, the wiring, the data plumbing is all APIs, getting the information. At the core model of REST APIs are requests and responses. That's pretty much what it boils down to. If you have, for example, an application, could be in whatever language, Ruby, Java, React, whatever. Come on in. Wow, we're running out of seats, Bill. Anywhere you want? Yep. Yeah. At the core is this model of REST and responses. So it's language agnostic. Your application can be in any kind of language. It executes a response in the way that language makes responses. It executes a request that goes across HTTP, which is what we use to surf the web all the time, right? You type in HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, sends that information to some REST API server in the cloud, and that server does whatever it does and responds with whatever it was asked for through the same means. It sends the information back through HTTP. This is why they're called web APIs. They're an API that makes its transmission of information across the web. A typical request might look like this, where you have some URL that specifies, for example, homes and a parameter and so forth, and it has a specific type of method that it's just getting it. We'll jump more into this soon. And the response is typically in JSON, it could be XML. It looks somewhat like that with the curly braces and the could be square brackets and so forth, depending upon the type of information. Key value pairs are returned, and then the application can make use of it. Now this model should be familiar because it's the same model that the web follows. The web is built on the same request and response over HTTP kind of transaction. If you go to my website, I'dratherBeWriting.com, and you type that in the browser, you're sending a GET request through that Chrome, whatever browser you have, to a server that then says, oh, let me get the information at that resource. And it says, you know, here's the home page, and it sends the information back. In this case, it responds with HTML rather than like a JSON kind of block. And the browser, all the browser does is make it look pretty. It takes and formats it for readable display. But every time you go to any kind of website online, it's essentially a request and a response that follows a very similar model as the web API. So if you just keep that in mind, that we're really dealing with requests and responses, it kind of boils down this whole field into the core element. All right, we're coming to the first activity. So this is activity 1A. So if you go to I'd rather be writing API doc workshop activities, and you expand 1A, this is what it is, all right? Identify your goals with API documentation. This is sort of a get to know you activity as well, but this is a significant effort that you're undertaking, right? You've decided to spend all day learning here. Maybe you flew up here, or maybe this is a part of a larger effort. But transitioning into API documentation and excelling in this field requires a lot of time and energy. So I want you to kind of think about some questions. Why are you taking this course? What are your career ambitions related to this? Are you in a place where there are lots of developer documentation jobs? What would you consider to be a success metric? Sorry for the business jargon. Well, you know, what would be one criteria that would make it so that this course was worthwhile? And do you feel like you kind of have the technical mindset to excel in this field? So why don't you think about that for a few minutes, and then I'll ask people if they want to share, just so we can get to know you better, and I can better understand, you know, why you're here, what you want to learn, where you are right now. So I'll give everybody a couple minutes. You can think about this or jot these down in some kind of notebook, doesn't matter. And if you got here late and didn't get food, there's lots of food here. And coffee, I guess.
How long do you have?
Just take a couple minutes for this. If you do need a bathroom, they're out this door and around the corner. Don't take too many twists and turns around here. You'll never make it back. See, I was checking off names to see who's here. Are you Kenneth or
Nope,
David?
I'm David.
David, okay. All right. So who would like to share? Why are you taking this course? This, as I said, helps me tailor the information. Obviously, I don't just want to sit here and project one way. Anybody care? Julie.
Yeah, I am with NetApp, and I'm working on a project that's a collaboration project with Microsoft, and we already use GitHub to document information, but Microsoft is going to give us a Swagger file from which we need to kind of figure out how to document. So I'm the only writer, and we can help
Cool.
writing on that.
So you have a collaborative effort, and another company is going to deliver their docs as a Swagger file to you. Nice, and you're like wanting to know what the best way to work with that is and so forth. We'll totally dive into that. I think that's like the core part of so much around API docs. So, anybody else? Why are you taking this course? Yes.
I'm a technical editor, and our writers are producing REST API documentation, and I
Okay.
need to edit it, and I need to know, like, if it's good or.
Whether we're lying to you or not, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
That's
you
what I'm talking about.
okay? So you just have a better sense of how to evaluate and critique and review the REST API documentation you're getting. We'll totally provide you with like what you need to evaluate this. I think, especially, the sections will cover that. We cover both the reference, or I cover both the reference and the non-reference part. A lot of times people reduce API docs to just the reference, and that's totally incomplete. And we'd talk about 10 sections in the non-ref. You can see what docs have it and don't, and how they distinguish themselves. Anybody else? Yes.
So the company I work for, there's 2 different projects that have 2 different APIs that are using 2 different programs that integrate with Swagger to produce that reference information. And so I'm trying to come in and create some consistency across the 2 platforms, and also see how we can get that non-reference information where it needs to be for all of our integrators.
Okay. I think you emailed me about this, right? Yeah. So you've got like some 2 different frameworks, and they're both putting like annotations in the code for the Swagger, and then producing out the doc.
I'm not
Okay.
sure that that's even the best method. So.
Okay. Yeah, we'll talk about that. That seems to be a recurring theme. Is do you generate this file from the code? Do you do it, first outside of the code and use it as a blueprint, or what? And it sort of depends on a lot of different factors. But glad you got that in mind. So it sounds like a lot of Swagger-related stuff, which is good. Anybody else? Purpose for the course? Dan in the back.
So I'm the tools guy at the company. We've got an existing product that I guess they added an API to. They haven't been too concerned with. They don't actually use Swagger, but they've been playing with Markdown with that. A new product has come along that is purely API that's going to be released here first of the year or so. And they're all into the sizzle and stuff, and they don't want to conform with the existing system. It's a tool that was built by another company that we acquired, so nobody quite understands the pipeline, the chain of all the little things that are in there to make it all work. And of course, they want to push the envelope and make it look really sexy for this new site. And
Okay.
consistency be damned at this point.
So you've got like
What's going on?
You've got like an integration challenge of taking this API doc from another site, integrating it with your own content that's data-based and so
Well,
forth.
and that's going on too. So I know the data side.
Yeah.
This is the first place I've run into
Yeah.
dealing with Swagger. Swagger is what's underneath all of it right now.
Okay.
For some reason, the new group is Swagger doesn't do it for them. It doesn't have everything they need, so they're out running around also trying to find other
Okay.
implementations to make it sexier for them. It's like I'm trying to catch up on the system that already exists while they're running off in a completely other direction.
Yeah. Well, this is great. Yeah, integration challenges and the publishing and how you bring it all together is a constant theme as well. So we'll definitely dive into that. This part 4 is where I was planning to dive into the OpenAPI and Swagger stuff. We'll dive deeply into there, and hopefully we'll address all these questions. Anybody else? Purpose? Yes, in the front. When?
Yeah, our company just started doing API documentation. We don't use Swagger.
Okay.
The developers just put them in RAML
Okay.
files, and then just use a very simple tool, RAML to HTML, and just suck those information out.
Yeah.
So very
Wow. Wait, where did you say you work?
8 volt.
Aiden.
Volt.
Aiden. Okay. Wow. Yeah. So a competing spec is RAML, and I haven't heard too much about it lately. So it's interesting to hear that. MuleSoft is in this area, right? And they're the ones who created this competing spec to the OpenAPI or Swagger, and they have a lot of tooling built around it. You know, they've got like a full platform that processes everything. So cool. You know, it's not too different, the RAML versus the OpenAPI Swagger. I used to actually have a section on RAML in my course, but I got so few like inquiries about it that I put it down in the like resources, I buried it. All right, anybody, but still good. Yes, in the back.
So this course is the perfect timing because we're moving from REST, what we call 1.0 to 2.0, which is going to be based on Swagger, and it's going to be, everything's going to be run through REST API endpoints. And so we have hundreds of endpoints that I need to document. So the developers have taken kind of the first stab at it. I just want to know how I can efficiently go through and edit everything properly.
Okay.
And then also to customize a skin and create static documentation for dark sites.
For what was that last one?
Dark sites.
Dark sites?
Where they can't access.
Oh,
the
okay.
web.
Oh, I was like, for the dark web? For that? It's like, my Silk Road API? Okay. Yeah, so you've got hundreds of APIs to document. You've got engineers involved in like helping and collaborating, and you have to take and pull it all together and make it sizzle with the way it's published and so forth. Yeah, it's interesting to hear so many kind of Swagger themes in your comments. And
I just have a question.
yes.
So I guess, you know, we know how to write and we know how to edit, but I want to learn from this course how technically savvy you have to be, how much coding you need to know in order to survive in this field, because I took an interview and I flunked it because they asked me very challenging Java-related questions.
Yeah.
And you know, I thought there was this one side to API documentation where you can just generate it and then edit it and that's it. But there's a whole new, dark side, I don't know, a side that I'm not really aware of. And I was like, okay, it just shook my confidence. Like, okay,
Yeah.
maybe this is not as easy or, as doable as I thought it is.
I actually added a whole section in this course that I've never gone through before on getting a job in API Docs, where we talk about how tech savvy do you need to be. And just as a nutshell, I think there's a spectrum. Like, if you aren't super techy to get all the code of whatever it is they're documenting, you can still assist in publishing, editing, but the more you know, the more you can kind of dip into the content authoring and collaboration. So you can do both content authoring and editing and publishing. But honestly, in this area, companies there don't exist people who are like masterful with language and can speak 5 languages of code and can handle publishing and integration of all this stuff. They don't exist. We've been trying to hire at our company. They do not exist. So people, as I mentioned earlier, companies end up hiring somebody who may not be totally qualified, but they're the least unqualified. Like they're as good as they can get. It's just a challenging field, and things are becoming more and more specialized. So the ability to kind of dig in at the sort of level that maybe we were used to in non-developer content, it isn't as possible. I know this is a frustration I've felt. Had this whole presentation on like trends and this challenge between, well, am I a generalist or specialist, and how much do I need to know? But yeah, we'll dive into that a bit more. All right, let's see. How about one more person? Why are you taking this course, and what are the challenges that, you're trying? Dave.
Yeah, well, actually, I've got an email open here to articulate better than I could.
Okay, sure.
So I'm with IBM Security, and my boss, the title is our boss. We just call him boss. Anyway, she wrote an email to one of the development managers, and it said about this course, forwarded the information about this course, and then she said, the API docs are pretty sparse, and unfortunately, developers are not the best writers. That part I knew. We need to get our documentation team up to speed on what is needed, and then work with the agile teams to get the work done. So along with that, I'd just say, much as the last speaker was saying, I half the terminology I've heard already is not familiar to me. So I'm a novice when it comes to.
So you've got a bunch of APIs that you're going to be working with. The engineers have sort of been doing a lot of it, but engineers aren't great writers, and it's not what people want. Production level quality, and now you're being asked to come in and help out and figure out how to bring the API
We
docs.
produced an API doc, or
Yeah.
the API guide, as it's called. Another writer actually took care of that. But, yeah, so I think that
Cool.
means that we're going to lend our expertise to that end of it.
All right. Well, you're in the right place. These are all topics that we're going to dive into. And this is one of the reasons why what started out as sort of these 3 workshops to that staffing company a few years ago evolved into this full-fledged course, because there's such an interest in this topic. It's sort of mind-boggling. I'm pretty convinced that jobs in tech comm have been shifting from GUI type jobs to where the target audience is an end user of some kind, to audiences where the target audience is a developer. I wish I could find hard, concrete evidence for this beyond just people agreeing with me on surveys and say, yes, I mostly agree. But the fact that people constantly ask me to give presentations and workshops on this topic reinforces the fact that this is this industry-wide trend, this shift. And it is complex and difficult. It is not an easy thing. It's not like, oh, you just need to learn this new little gizmo and you're all good. No, it's deep. These are tough issues, but ones that will make you, so much more head and shoulders above other candidates when you have that. Like, just on the Swagger alone, which is officially called the Open API, the number of technical writers who can create an Open API specification from a REST API, I think is in the less than 5%. That alone, I think, could really make your career a game changer. Okay, we're done with this first section, and let's go back here. Yes.
And maybe this is a question for everyone in the room, but how many people are going to spend all of their time on API documentation, and how many people are still stuck between all their other projects that they have to cover?
Yeah. So, okay, I'm curious, how many people, is API docs just one fraction of your role, or is this becoming 75%? Fraction. Yep. This kind of provides more support for the generalist position, where it's you're probably asked to do UX copywriting still too, right? People develop, mocks of some interface, and they need a language expert, and they also want you to write a blog post and do API docs and SDK guide and so forth. Yeah. All right, so now we're going to get into some hands-on stuff, because I feel like in order to really understand this whole world of APIs, you kind of need to put on a developer hat and make a few requests and responses and just get a general sense of how developers would use a REST API. And once we do that, then we'll put back the technical writer hat on and figure out, well, okay, now that I know what it's about, what are the parts that need to be documented, like the core elements, and it will make more sense. But without this initial sort of experience of the API, I think it doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, I've dramatically simplified this, right? If you were to go to a real developer, they would probably be much more complex and deep, but I think at the core, this will capture it. Here is our scenario. Okay, remember, you're wearing a developer hat, you're at a new company, and now I'm a bicycle commuter, so this is an important detail for me. I want to know, how windy is it? Is there a strong headwind all the way to work, or is it good? What's the deal? So let's say that you're developing a website and you want to have some kind of weather check on there that will welcome, come on in. Hey, no problem. You're just getting into the second section. If you can find a chair. I know the traffic on this Bay Area can be hit or miss. So. All right, your scenario is this. People come to you and they say, we want to build this little weather widget on our site that will let people know the basic weather conditions. How windy is it? What's the temperature, the direction, the wind, general conditions. And obviously we're not a meteorological service, so we need to go out and grab this weather information from some service, some other site. And we'll have to use an API to do it. And here's kind of a preview of what we're going to build. This little guy right here, when you click it, it's going to go get the information and populate it through an API request and then print it right there on the site. So we're not going to deal with all the styling that I've shown here, but the kind of point is probably the same. All right? So just keep that sort of scenario in mind. Now, a fancy implementation might look more like this, right? If you go to, what is this, Yahoo Weather or something, you can see all this information that they've styled attractively. And for example, they can put the details about humidity and put cool graphics. But at its core, this site, what is this site? It's a bunch of API calls to a weather service. All right. Now, the first question would be, which API would we choose? And when I first created this course, I chose the simplest weather API I could find. But I found that there were like a ton of problems with that API. It wasn't well supported, and it kept breaking, and it gave me so many headaches. So I eventually changed to one that I thought was much more stable, even though it's not as straightforward in some ways. But this is from OpenWeatherMap. Welcome, come on in. Wow, there's 2 seats left, or 3. Great. Okay, if you go to openweathermap.org, you can see this API. This is a site that tries to make a lot of information about weather for free. You can get a sense of what it tends to offer. All right, and we're going to jump into this. I'm just sort of giving you an overview. If you click API, you can see that they offer various endpoints. You can get the current weather, 5-day forecasts, you can get all kinds of stuff. Weather stations, relief maps, weather alerts. All of these are different APIs, and they each have, they're different like endpoints within their OpenWeatherMap API. They'd call them APIs individually as well. And if you go into one, you can see that it's got like sample calls and so forth, and it shows an example of what returns. For example, if you were to call that, a sample response might be this, and so forth. All right, so that is going to be our weather API. I evaluated a lot of different weather APIs, and this one tends to be very stable and functional. Okay, so, all right. Activity 2A, if you just kind of got here, let me show you. We've got a page in the site that shows you where to get these activities. So we're going to do this 2A, explore the OpenWeatherMap API. If you go to my blog, I'd rather be writing.com, click API doc, and then click workshop activities right here on the left. You'll see activity 2A, explore the OpenWeatherMap API. So you'll go to this site, click the current weather data by clicking the API doc button in that section. And I want you to explore what information is available through this API, through this endpoint in the API. Does the API provide the information that we need? Does it have the information about the weather that we want? The wind, the temperature, it probably does. Otherwise, I wouldn't have chosen it. But try to figure that out. How many different ways can you specify the location? What does a sample request look like? Let's see. I've blocked your path here, but you can probably get around.
Very good.
Welcome.
Thanks.
Sure. All right. And let's see. How many endpoints does the API have? And what authorization credentials will be required in order to make the request? So you go ahead and do this. I'll give you 5 minutes to kind of get oriented on this, and then in the next activity you'll get authorization keys, and then the next one you'll make requests and use curl and Postman and so forth. So just kind of get oriented with this. Let's see, I'm going to guess your name is Kenneth, right?
No, I'm Barry.
Barry. Barry. Oh, okay. I was told you would be coming. Okay.
Here we go. That's good. Great. Here. Oh,
All right. Yeah, we're going to be using a sample weather API just to make a request and see a response to get more familiar with the general workflow of how developers would use an API. In this OpenWeatherMap one, why don't we go through some of these questions here? So, does the API provide the information we need about temperature, wind speed, wind direction, and current conditions? Yeah, if you go to this example, for example, you can see here we've got weather, we've got, let's see, wind, and it's got speed and so forth. What else? Got some cryptic abbreviations, DT text. This is something you'll encounter in corporate APIs a lot. Sometimes companies will purposely obfuscate what these keys are. What else? Temperature, temp max, and so forth. You know, one thing that's immediately apparent is that 277 is a different unit of measurement, unless we're near the sun. And yeah, the general description, clear sky. So yeah, basically, this is the first thing developers will look for. They're like, does this API have the kind of information that I'm going to need in my application? And there's quite a bit of information returned here. Wow, this is actually quite long. The longer these are, the slower it all becomes, right? Because now a person's going to have to like parse through this and maybe do some loops or something to check for certain fields. So hopefully there's a way to limit the response so that it narrows it down more to what we want. But it's a sample. All right. How many different ways can you specify the location for the weather information? By city name, you can do. All right. Q equals London. Got by city ID. And now they've got a bunch of like custom IDs in some kind of JSON file. and they really like you to do that. Whoever like OpenWeatherMap is, I don't think English is their first language, but anyway, by geographic coordinates, by zip code. That was kind of a mean comment. There was a different part where they kept using the word respond instead of response, and I finally just emailed them and said, hey, here's a tip. By zip code and so forth. So you've got several ways to get this information. All right. And what does a sample request look like? Well, for example, with the zip code, probably bring this up. This is a sample request. This is the endpoint, or this is the base URL, the weather is the end part of it, and then some parameters. We'll dive into that, but that's what a sample request looks like. And a sample respond. Here's the API respond. This is a sample information that is returned. And what authorization credentials would you need to get this response? Well, in their sample response, they actually don't show you passing the API key, which is kind of misleading because they show it here in this demo, but you're going to have to pass an app ID with your API key here. So you do actually need an API key. Very few APIs don't have authorization. Almost all of them do. Only very like open, public, general ones that are read-only wouldn't have an API key. So in order to work with this, you will need to get an API key. So this moves us on to activity 2B, get OpenWeatherMap authorization keys.
Can I just ask, sorry?
Yeah.
Question?
Yeah, no.
That'll be my last today. If you were to define endpoint, what would you define?
Yeah, this part right here, let me come back to it. And I do plan to dissect this later, but this part that says /weather would be considered the endpoint. Literally, endpoint means like the end part of the request, because all of the requests are going to use this common base api.openweathermap.org/data/2.5. If you look at the other ones, they will all have that, but they will differ in this path here that says weather. Some will say, like if we go back to 5-day forecast, you can see that here it's /forecast. So the endpoint generally refers to the way you access whatever information is sitting on the server that you want returned, the resource. It's kind of the core of what an API consists of, a list of different URLs that have these different end parts that return information. But yeah, we're going to dissect this in the next section. We're going to look at like the 5 components of what to document, and I'll get more detailed in that part. Any other high-level thoughts about like just this OpenWeatherMap and getting familiar with it? Okay, not a lot really there. Just kind of, hey, this is what we're using. But now go ahead and do 2A. Get an OpenWeatherMap API key. Sorry, 2B, thanks. You're going to click sign up here, and by the way, this is free. Click sign up, sign in, whatever. I'm already signed in. And then once you're signed in, you'll see this dashboard where it says API keys, and just copy your key. Oh. Well, this might be problematic. Your API key will be activated and ready for using within a couple of hours. Hopefully it won't.
In the how to use the API section,
Huh.
it takes it can take up to an hour to get here.
We'll find out. If that's the case, I'll just send you mine, I guess. Yeah, hopefully it'll work. If not, yeah, probably won't run into issues if I have to email this, but.
So we do have to create a new account.
Yeah, I probably should have had you do this earlier, but forgot. At any rate, it should be fairly simple. And once you have the API key, we'll be able to get to the fun part by making requests.
Oh, this email. So it says a couple hours, but it shows me a team.
Yeah, hopefully it'll work.
Okay.
Do you need to create two and use the default again?
No, just use the default. Okay, does everybody have their API key? Okay, if you didn't, then hopefully you'll be able to do that. Okay, now, before we get into this, submitting requests. One of the most common tools that you'll use to submit requests when you're working with an API is something called Postman. Have you, who here has worked with Postman? Just raise your hand so I get a sense. Like 5 people, 4, yeah, 5 people. All right, so Postman is a REST client, as they say. It gives you this little interface here in order to make a request. It's probably the default tool that most developer shops use, in part because A, it's free, B, it just works, and C, it's a freaking cool tool. It's got a lot of neat things about it. You can even build your documentation using Postman automatically from all the information you have. I don't know that many people who actually do that, but in my current company, my colleague had a project where the team used Postman extensively for all of their endpoints, and they sort of had a lot of information around here. So what the Postman team would like to see happen is developer teams use Postman and have this synced account where everybody has this kind of synchronized information. And then when you need documentation, click a button, bam, you're done. I don't think they're quite there yet, because obviously you need a lot more topics and space to write other tutorials and everything. But for the reference part, you can actually do that. But it's not really the intent here. I'm just telling you that it does more than just make requests. But when you open it up here, you're gonna find that in the middle you've got this big giant box where you can make requests, and you can see responses and so forth right here. Now we're gonna do activity 2C, make a request with Postman, and here's what you'll do. If you haven't already installed Postman, just go to getpostman.com, install it. It's a standalone app. It shouldn't be too hard. Go ahead and open it up, and once you open it up, by default it opens up to the get method. We'll talk more about these later, but get means just read the information. And I want you to make a request. You'll insert this endpoint into this is the weather endpoint on that site, the OpenWeatherMap site. Whoops, I actually didn't mean to make the request yet. And once you insert that, click params on the right, short for parameters, and you need to insert a couple of parameters in this request. One, a zip code. You can use your own zip code. So you do zip, put that there. And units, if you don't want to use the metric unit, I think, or whatever it is, their standards. And then, let's see, one other, app ID. Here's the one where we find out if these API keys are going to work or not. So, API key, where's my thing? Oh, there we go. All right. Once you have that, you'll see that every parameter you add here is adding the parameter in the URL as well. We'll talk more about this later, just getting you familiar with the request. And when you hit send, it should provide a valid response down there. All right, so make sure everybody can do this request. He's gonna be key here. I'll give you a few minutes to work your way through there. And yeah, so when you're done with activity 2C, let me know. If you're running it.
I get the save request box. What's the name, request name?
Oh, yeah, you can save it if you want. Go ahead and.
Looks like I have to.
Yeah, maybe I'd already saved mine and forgot. Yeah, if you're prompted to save it, do so, because it will appear on the left where you can easily run it again in a collection, so to speak. Raise your hand if you're having technical issues or need other help. Come over. Okay.
Hi, I got my, this is the key they gave me.
Okay.
Is it going key or app ID? I guess I assume
Yeah,
it's
that-
app ID.
yeah.
This is the example.
Yep.
And then when I send this is the example link that they gave me. I get an invalid API key.
I do the same thing, use the default one that comes up.
What's the default?
Go back to your screen.
Okay.
Go back to where, the weather, where you got your key originally.
So your API key,
Yep.
that one doesn't work? Oh,
That
yeah.
one doesn't work now, that one worked for me. When I created one, it didn't work.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, but you have that pasted in, it doesn't work?
Right.
Try, go back to this here. Refresh the page real quick. And then open up to whatever, 2B or what was it? 2, yeah, scroll down. Oh, I just added that, it's not there yet, okay. Give it a minute, I put a sample key up there. And I thought it would be published there, but it's not yet. Give me a sec. Is anybody getting like failed messages with your API key?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
Oh,
I did, and this is a new key. This is the new key, and it's not.
So can you show
yeah,
them
yeah, now you can customize the first and
How
third.
do I turn that on? Oh.
You can press get authorization.
It's always a typo. Usually send it should work. This is the inbox. This is the response.
Yeah, try getting another way.
Yeah. So if you go to weather,
Okay. Refresh your screen one more time. Okay, if your API key isn't working, I just added mine here. So if you refresh that page, you can see on activity 2A, you can see a sample one. Copy that one instead, see if you get it to work. Sorry, I'm standing right in front of there.
So, use that, okay.
Yeah, refresh your page to see that. I just pushed that up there like a minute ago.
Watch out, you can only send requests from one API key no more often than one per 10 minutes.
Really?
It says in the how to start section.
I did twice.
Oh,
the
did
same
you?
request and it
worked?
worked, so I'm gonna hold off on that. Yeah.
Did you use your API key?
Yeah.
Your own one? And yours is working? Your API
I
key?
just did it. I mean, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hey,
Do you want to use it?
Oh no, I'm fine. I
Mine still doesn't work.
Did you try this API key instead?
I haven't, okay.
Yeah, try that one.
Come on, don't make people type that.
No, just refresh the screen and you'll.
Oh, the control.
I just added it. Yeah,
It's in 2C?
2A.
A 2A.
2A. If you don't see it, just refresh your page.
There we go.
That's interesting.
Now I'll click
It might
send.
be half.
Yeah.
Am I getting the right?
No, it says invalid API key.
Still in
Oh, still. Where does it say I'm missing it?
You gotta paste it in right there. Like try to paste where it says
I see,
API
I
key.
see, I see.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Try yours, and if it doesn't work, try
It
that one.
actually gave me the same result.
This gave you the same result?
Yeah.
Man,
Me too.
foiled again.
The API key in there, I think about units and it says internal error. Maybe it's something I screwed up.
Huh.
I mean, I just copied it from here.
Yeah. Wait, can you go back and let me see?
Yeah, that's the new one.
Oh, yeah, it's a 2B. It's, but, yeah, but
Yeah.
it's the Chinese wrong.
Is this correct? Should it be imperial?
Why don't you just uncheck units for a minute? I don't think that will do anything, but yeah, I do not know.
Interesting.
It could be that I've now violated their terms of service.
Oh, his key works.
Did yours work?
Yeah, no, mine doesn't, but when I put in your key, it worked. Mine got a 401, invalid API key.
What? Wow, you've got it exactly as she does, and you're getting a
Probably It's all
404.
generated today. Like today's
Maybe
key
we're
is
all
just
using
no
it at the
good.
same time.
Yeah?
The app ID they give you has ampersand app ID equal in the app ID. They need to delete, get rid of that prefix.
Oh, do you have that? You have that in the, what's on the very right on the,
So look for
There's nothing
text
there.
before.
I mean, in the this
Ampersand
field?
app ID.
Is there an
You have to
extra
get rid of
one?
that?
Yes. Get rid of everything.
Yeah, you've got
before-
two, no,
It should be just
my bad.
the copy after the equal sign.
I have no
But I don't get rid
idea.
of the imperial, the other.
Are you
parameters
connected
before
to,
that.
you are connected to the Wi-Fi.
Okay, so get rid of all the.
You know what, I don't know. I'm
Okay.
not
Okay,
sure.
that's
It looks
fine.
like you're using this for other stuff. You've got, so you,
Practicing, but that shouldn't
Yeah, I got rid of ampersand app ID. Yeah.
you could just try it again. You could delete it and try it again.
Nope. Now I get
Sorry,
a different
it seems like
error.
you're doing it right.
Now I get invalid API key.
Now you do, but you weren't
Because
before?
I took out the ampersand app ID equal,
Yeah?
and it changed from 404 to 401.
Oh, yeah. So it's,
It's a change.
but, all right,
401 with my key also.
This is progress,
So this is,
right?
this is your key.
okay.
She's got a different error. She's
Get different?
internal errors.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, miscalculation on my part. I should have had you sign up for the API key earlier. I'm guessing that it's saying we're getting a lot of requests from different people using the same API key, and it's weird. But raise your hand if you got a successful message, so we know. Oh, so it's not a complete failure. Okay, we're got like 90% people. The people who are getting internal errors, you're doing it right. I just don't know why it's saying that. Oh, for the people who were successful, raise your hand if you used the API key that you just generated. Oh, so like half of you. And the other people use this one? Okay. That is weird.
I'm still getting internal.
Yeah, I used, I tried both. It didn't work. Actually, I haven't tried yet. I think it just, we're overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Does the room have a Slack chat where we could just share these numbers?
No, there's not. But if you want to share your API key with her to see if it works.
Yeah, I used yours.
Sorry, I don't. You could just email it to her, or she could try to copy it.
I had a fail, and then I tried it again with the same key, it didn't work. So-
Okay.
So maybe the server.
What's the designated to the sender?
See, I tried to pick an API that would not crash like this or have issues, but it seems like when we have lots of people all of a sudden hitting it with the same API key, it's freaking out. So
Yeah.
I've had
Hopefully-
classes with Flickr, just saying. It's
Yeah, Flickr's API key.
robust. Yeah,
Yeah, I use the generating.
and you get pretty pictures.
Ah, okay, so we're gonna try that.
Yeah, hopefully your
Got rid of this fault that was there.
hopefully your key will kick in. I can't really imagine why it would take 2 hours for a API key to become active. Like, are they manually typing something in?
Oh, just give it a name.
Yeah, just make it.
Depending if they have to go apart from data centers or something.
Yeah.
But they didn't work right away.
That's my guess. So we're just doing the one.
Let me see. I think, let's see, I think I actually have you do one more, right? No,
That's
Not yet.
the server on that side.
For 5 day course.
oh yeah, try the 5-day one as well. Okay, so after you do this first one, you'll be prompted to save it. And you can, once you save it, it appears in this little collection area, depending upon whatever you called it. Oops. You can see these right here. So if I wanted to run a different one, it easily loads and so forth, and I can run it again. This is what's nice about Postman, is that you can set up all the endpoints for your API. You have them all listed here, or however you group them, and then you can easily tweak them. You can have variations. You can save all these. Every time you have a request, you can click save or save as, and you can save that variation, because you might have like one parameter for this zip code. You might have the city ID. You might have the special city, whatever location parameter you want to put in there, different units. And you could set up like 10 different test cases, save them all, and then if you really wanted to get into it, you could probably execute some kind of script that would do it more programmatically. But for your purposes, in documenting, you could just explore different scenarios, see what kind of error messages happen. It's really good practice to try to break it. For example, if you wanted to experiment and see, well, what happens if I type zip in all caps, see what happens. Oh, I get a COD 400, it's like, whoa, they can't even spell code. But that kind of thing is what Postman allows you to easily do and play around with. So there's one more endpoint to try. This is there's lots more you could try, but in this activity, it's the 5-day forecast one. So if you come out to the API and you click 5-day forecast, 5-day 3-hour forecast, you can actually do any of them really, but just choose one. Here, the only thing that's different is the word forecast instead of weather. So that is the endpoint, right? And the same way that you specify location should be the same. City ID, geo coordinates, whatever you've chosen. I think zip code was the most reliable for me, so I used that. Come back in here, click the new tab button, or you could do save as, actually, probably be easier. Save as. Whatever, save it. Then just change the weather to forecast, hit send, and see if you get a response. I thought that from one API key, I was able to make like up to 100 calls a minute or something. It's like, imagine if you put this on your website, and every time the site loads, it should display the information. Surely they can handle a certain capacity for web traffic that would be reasonable. Of course, that's where the price point hits, right? This is the free one. Maybe at the paid version, you get 600 calls per minute instead of 60 calls per minute. But yeah, calls per minute, 60. So I don't know why some people are getting errors, even when they're using my API key.
Their server could have rate limits.
Okay. But it should support 60 per minute, right? Like, yes?
What's the value of using an API ID as opposed to using one of the authentication methods, authorization methods?
That is you're saying,
Username cat, why would I do one or the other?
why would you choose the for this API, that is the way they're authenticating through that. It's an API key.
Is there any pro and con in terms of doing it as a parameter as opposed
Oh.
to using it in the header?
Yeah. We will talk about that in a minute, but oh, you finally got a valid response?
On the forecast, yeah. But I didn't type forecast, I used the, from the page under Friday forecast.
Okay.
Used that call.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, so the app ID that was just baked into their example, is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
And
Interesting.
I used your key, and it worked. And
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, good. There are different authentication methods. The API key is easiest, but maybe it's not the most secure. There are some others where, whether the API key is passed as a query parameter or a header parameter, I'm not really sure what advantages there are in either. But there are some other methods, one called HMAC, which we'll get into a little bit, just as an exposure, and then like the OAuth methods, and there's even like another method as well. But the API key is probably the most common. It depends which industry you're in. Some people feel like the HMAC might be the most secure. But yeah, I'll talk about that. I don't really have any comments specifically about the header parameter versus the query parameter for the key. It makes it a lot easier as a query parameter, to be honest, because then you could just type this same URL. We're using Postman for this, but since all the parameters are in the URL, if you go into any web page and do it, you're going to get the response. I have a JSON formatter on Chrome, so it looks pretty, but you should see it. Just makes it a little easier. Whereas if you have a header parameter, you can't really do that. You have to do a different method, which is actually a great segue into curl. Okay, any other questions on Postman before we move on? Yes?
If you aren't using Postman, what are you using instead?
Like what are the other options?
Yeah.
Okay, so curl is probably a very common option because it's tends to work. It tends to fit well into like testing scenarios where they can create scripts that automate these things. If you're into Macs and you're like, surely there's a Mac app for this. There's one called Paw that's really quite impressive. Let me see if I think I still have it. Yeah, the Paw app. It looks very similar, and as you know, my license isn't valid for it right now. No, wait. I think it is. Let me try this one. The nice thing about Paw is that, sorry about that. You can easily toggle through the responses. Okay.
This is a tool to do the writing of the request?
No, this is just another GUI client for making requests. You said what alternatives are there to Postman? This is one alternative, and this one is actually quite nice. It's just the reason is that I haven't promoted it is because A, it only works on the Mac, and B, it costs $30. But what's cool about it is that in the response, it shows it as collapsible sections, which makes it a little easier to parse through. You can also just look at the raw response, which is not even minified, but it's cool in that way. It also has a lot more plugins that allow you to take and push the information out into different formats. Export request, for example. I'll get into this more a little bit later, but you can easily, let's say you're working in a Java application, you can grab the code to make the request in Java and so forth. It's just an alternative. There are probably a dozen different REST clients like this in addition to curl. Something to keep in mind. But yeah, you definitely want to use some kind of client or even just curl, because the number one thing you need to do as an API doc writer is test out the API calls to make sure they work and that they return the information that you're promising in the documentation. So if I were you as an editor looking at these things, you might just pick and choose like 3 or 4 different endpoints, make the request, and see, does this response match up with what they're promising in the documentation? And in part, that's a little bit problematic because like maybe different endpoints based on the parameters you pass will have different responses. And so in the sample request, it might match the response, but in general, the endpoint might have more parameters or more items in the response had the user pass different parameters. I'll get into that more later, but basically checking the alignment between requests and responses would be key, in my opinion, about how to evaluate just REST API docs in general.
And you can do that just with the client.
Yeah, you can do it just with this. You can save the responses as well. If you wanted to save this response, you can see what it looks like in XML and so forth, if that's what it is.
Really not XML. I mean, that's JSON
Yeah.
in curly brackets.
You're right.
Really give you the true XML.
I think basically, I'm not sure why this option is presented. You're right, that's kind of weird. Usually, like some APIs will let you specify an XML format as the response format, and I guess I would assume it would be automatic here, but maybe you have to manually select that.
There's a mode equals XML.
Okay, in this one.
Your content type.
Okay. All right. Let me think. Where was I? Curl. Yes. All right. How many of you have worked with curl before? So like 5 or 6. All right. Curl is a C URL, not a command line URL, something like that. It's a way to interact with it's a way to make requests, web requests through the command line, and it's used quite commonly. You start out with the word curl, and then you have some parameters, and you specify the method, and then you put the endpoint. And you run this from the command line. So for example, if I copy this, and I come into my preferred terminal editor, and I paste this in, I can make, it gives me the response. Now this is minified. If I were to take the response and like unminify it through some site like JSON pretty print, it would look normal. Whoops, there we go. So it would be more similar to what you're seeing. But essentially, curl is very commonly used as a demonstration of how to make a request. So you should be familiar with it. Now I had you install curl before because it's a nightmare to install sometimes on Windows, and I always run into issues. So if you were able to install it, great. If you weren't, not that big of a deal, but it's still very worth having. Now these are some common curl commands. If you include -i, then it will include the response header. This is part of information that when you go to a website, you don't often see. You know, if you go to, I'd rather be writing and you're like, oh, I just see the body, but really there's a header there as well. If I come back in my command line and I make a request to my site, right? By default, it's returning the HTML, but there's also a header there. So if I want to include the response header, you can see that this is the information that is also returned. This is what your browser doesn't show you when you go to a bunch of sites. But you can see here that I've got a 200 response header and some other metadata. Your browser actually sees all this stuff, you know, your access control, when it expires and so forth. So this kind of information is also important because when people make requests, they often want to know what kind of information is returned in that header. But anyway, these are the different methods that you can use with curl. You can also, and this is probably the most common reason you would use curl, is let's say you're configuring a system and it requires you to submit this huge like JSON block in the requests, well, you can store that in a file and refer to that file, and it will load that whole thing from a file using this command here. We're not going to go through that, but just keep in mind that that's one advantage. All right, so for fun, and the responses. If you've never worked with JSON before, there are two main types of data formats that JSON has. One is an object, and you identify that with the curly brace. It consists of key value pairs. This is most commonly how responses are returned. The other main type is an array. You identify these through square brackets, and an array is simply a list of items. Now, responses can contain mixtures of these, right? If I go back into Postman and look at this response that was earlier, you can see here the whole thing is an object. Yeah, the whole thing is an object, but the object contains certain keys that format their information as an array. So this is an array, list has an array, and the first item in the array is an object, as well as a second, and so forth. So you have these combinations of the two, and why is that essential to know? Well, when you access the information through dot notation, you kind of need to know that, all right? But just keep in mind the two main types of information that are returned. Okay, so I want you to try to make a request with curl. This is workshop activity 2D. Here's an easy way to do it, all right? And this is where Postman becomes really cool as well. So open Postman, go into one of your requests. On the right, under the send button, kind of, where it says code, you see that little, it's kind of a subtle link there. Click code, and then select curl as your format. And it will automatically show you how to make this same request in curl. If you were working with like JavaScript, you could see how to make the request using JavaScript, but we're just going to do the curl. So copy that. You can see that it includes -x get. So this is specifying the method, meaning it's a read-only. It's including its own header for reasons I don't understand why they want to stick their header in there, but I don't believe it will affect anything. And then it puts the endpoint. So open up your terminal, paste that in there, and see if you get a JSON response. It should look something kind of like, whoa, there's a lot of stuff there. Wow.
So for me, I had to do two things differently when I copied it from curl, from Postman into the curl window.
Okay.
First off, it had single quotes instead of double quotes. So I had to change the single quotes to double quotes on mine, so like
Oh.
you see cache control and everything like that.
Yours had single quotes?
Mhm.
Mine
Yeah.
too.
Oh, yeah.
So I changed it to double quotes.
Okay.
Single word.
On Windows, the single quotes are problematic with curl. I don't know why, but they are. Good call out.
And then the second one was that on mine, it has like kind of the end of line, kind of, what would you call it, like the slant.
Oh, it broke out the lines?
Yeah,
Oh,
basically it
that's
broke
it,
out
yeah.
each one too. So once you do those two things,
Yeah.
then it looks at it as one long line with double quotes.
This is again where in my...
The single quotes and it worked fine. I mean, it's spewed out.
Now what terminal are you using? Are you using the default one, or are you using like a git bash terminal or something, or what?
Just use
The default? Okay.
I use git bash.
Okay, so that's probably the difference. The git bash terminal is more Mac-like, and it probably just uses, or more Unix-like probably, and it accepts these. But yeah, the Windows terminal by default is not my favorite place to be, in part because of those things. But yeah, go ahead and make that request, and let me know if you are successful.
And if we weren't successful installing kernels,
Then just kind of hang tight, and I mean, you could try it. You could just go through the motions, go into your terminal.
I did.
And is that a Mac though? What? Oh, it's there by default then. Yeah, yeah. So many stickers, I can't even tell. Oh, there it goes. There's the apple.
So it worked with.
Great. Yeah. Yeah. In all honesty, I mean, I know I don't want to get into PC versus Mac debates or Windows versus Mac, but the Mac's built-in kind of Unix kernel just makes a lot of things work easier by default, and one of them is curl. So if you're trying to figure out, like, should I get a Mac or Windows machine? Macs are going to be easier in some ways.
For what it's worth, I think the reason yours is so long is you have forecast rather than weather.
Yeah, you're right.
So
Good point.
it was bothering me that I couldn't figure out why mine wasn't the same, and that seems to be the difference.
Yeah, okay.
So what is the difference between Git CMD and Git Bash?
Git CMD.
Bash is like, isn't it a
I think-
Unix
What is Git CMD? Where is that? Is that what was installed through Git?
It
Okay.
gives me Git GUI, Git CMD, and Git Bash.
Oh, I'm not totally sure. I didn't have a Windows machine to check that out, so I didn't realize it gave you 3 options. I would try the Git Bash one. I'm not entirely sure.
I don't think it's like Git CMD is just a Windows
Okay.
terminal. I'm not
So
positive.
the thing is, with Git CMD, the copy paste works. With Git Bash, when I do my Control V, it just gives
But
me.
you can't use Control V. You have to use a yeah.
Right click and
Oh, okay, gotcha.
how many people were successful with their curl call? Who got errors or who had issues? Yeah, should I check it out?
No, I'm supposed to be able to just, after I copied,
Yeah.
I'm supposed to be able to just right click it?
Yeah, right click and paste. Okay, so you got to do 2 things. This is what the guy over there was saying. So go back to your thing. Copy this, change your quotes to double quotes, and then remove the backslashes. So you're going to have to go into a text editor, or maybe you can just do it here. Change those to double quotes, and at the end too, I think, and then get rid of the backslash, which they just put to make it more readable. Yeah, Windows for some reason doesn't like that.
What, did you take out the single quote?
No, I just didn't.
Oh, because I had done that. So I gotta go back and something in again, or.
I think it won't work without quotes of some sort.
Size.
Yeah, quotes are required, it just went with single or double.
I got you.
Mine worked with single quotes.
But I don't know why I had to do both. I just copied it, so I text editor and just
Yeah.
kind of go in and clean and all that. and
Yeah.
copy it.
Okay, now I'll try this again. Right here, it works.
You got it worked with the quote thing?
Well, this is not an error, it's a bunch of gobbledygook.
Yeah, it's compressed. Yeah, that's great. Okay.
It's a lot of it, boy.
So this is what I was talking about earlier when I said the workshop activities. I've tried to make them issue free, and I just missed that one because I'm not usually on a Windows machine.
So Tom, I brought notebooks for everyone.
Okay. Yeah. Hey, why don't we take a 5-minute break? It looks like people kind of want a break, so take a 5-minute break. And Barry's also got some free swag stuff.
You know, sign up and pass it you out. Yeah.